58 years ago, a 9-year-old girl in Hazleton, Pennsylvania left home carrying lunchboxes and set off on foot toward school, vanished on a road less than half a mile long, and was found dead that same afternoon at the bottom of an abandoned coal mine pit, her lunchboxes lying beside her body. Authorities collected biological evidence from her clothing that very day and launched an investigation that would eventually involve more than 230 investigators and span more than half the entire history of the Pennsylvania State Police, yet no suspect was ever identified. The investigation ultimately reached a dead end, even after the killer's DNA profile was checked against the national database every single month for 15 consecutive years without a single match. Through all of it, however, the Pennsylvania State Police never formally closed the case and never stopped searching, and Marise's family never stopped waiting. Then, during the COVID pandemic, an 18-year-old college student came across the case, sent an email offering to help as a volunteer, and over the next 2 years constructed a family tree starting from a sixth cousin and narrowing it down, branch by branch, to a single name, a name that would shake the Hazleton community and everyone connected to the case in a way nobody had anticipated. Hazleton, Pennsylvania in March 1964 was a coal mining city in the eastern part of the state, 80 miles north of Philadelphia, an economy built on anthracite coal and populated by working-class immigrant families, Slavic, Italian, and Irish, who had been settling there since the late 19th century and had built their communities around Catholic churches and parochial schools. It was a place where children walked to school alone without anyone giving it a second thought. In November 1963, President Kennedy had just been assassinated and the country was still wrapped in national grief, but in Hazleton daily life continued at the familiar pace of a small industrial Pennsylvania town. People worked their shifts at the mines and factories, came home, and sat down to dinner with their families. Marise Ann Chiverella was 9 years old, a third-grade student at St. Joseph's Parochial School, the school of the Slovak-American Catholic community in Hazleton, situated less than half a mile from her home along residential streets she knew well. The Chiverella family lived in a densely populated neighborhood, parents and 5 children together, including Carmen, the younger sister who would spend the next 58 years carrying memories of her older sister with her. Marie was a child known for small, thoughtful gestures. On the morning of March 18, 1964, she left home walking toward St. Joseph's School, carrying lunchboxes she intended to give to her teachers, the kind of considerate act that captured exactly who she was at 9 years old. Her family watched her leave at around 8:10 in the morning. The route from their home to the school was short, under half a mile through familiar residential streets where neighbors recognized one another. But somewhere on that familiar road that morning, a man abducted her, raped her, and strangled her to death, then transported her body to an abandoned coal mine pit more than 2 miles from her home and left her there. At around 1 in the afternoon that same day, the hour when Marie should have been sitting in her classroom at St. Joseph's, a man who was out teaching his 16-year-old grandson to drive on the outskirts of Hazleton looked down into the abandoned coal pit and saw something that stopped him. They called the police. What the Pennsylvania State Police found in that abandoned coal mine pit in Hazle Township on the afternoon of March 18, 1964 confirmed the worst fears the Chiverella family had been carrying since Marie failed to arrive at school that morning and her teacher had called home to check on her. Marie Ann Chiverella, 9 years old, had been raped and strangled to death. This was not an accident. This was not an injury sustained while playing. It was a deliberate and brutal act. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as asphyxiation by strangulation combined with sexual assault. The fact that her body had been found more than 2 miles from her home made clear that the attacker had moved her after killing her, had driven her to that location at some point between 8:10 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon without being observed by anyone. At the scene, investigators collected biological evidence from Marie's coat and clothing. The attacker's semen was found and preserved according to the forensic standards of the time. In 1964, that kind of biological evidence could be used to determine blood type and little else. It could not generate a personal DNA profile, could not be cross-referenced against a national database, and offered investigators only the narrow advantage of being able to eliminate suspects whose blood type did not match. But that biological material was carefully preserved in the Pennsylvania State Police archives according to standard protocol. The Pennsylvania State Police assumed control of the investigation on March 18, 1964 and immediately mounted a comprehensive inquiry. This was not a minor case. A child had been abducted and murdered in broad daylight on her way to school, the kind of crime that shook an entire community and forced people to question the safety they had always taken for granted. Investigators canvassed everyone who lived or worked near the road Marie had walked that morning. They questioned drivers who had passed through the area between 8 and 9 in the morning. They looked closely at every man in the area with a history that raised suspicion. They cross-checked blood types against the biological evidence recovered from Marie's clothing. Suspects emerged and were eliminated one by one. This one ruled out by a confirmed alibi, that one because the blood type did not correspond, another because there was no realistic physical opportunity. Not a single name held up under scrutiny. The evidence available under the legal standards of 1964 was not sufficient to charge anyone. And James Paul Forte, the 22-year-old bartender who lived just 6 blocks from where Marie had disappeared, whose blood type was consistent with the evidence, and who had no obvious obstacle to having been in the area that morning, never appeared in any recorded portion of the initial investigation. He was never interviewed as a suspect. He was never asked to account for his whereabouts on the morning of March 18, 1964. He had lived 6 blocks from the crime scene, and nobody knocked on his door during the initial investigation with the right questions. The inquiry pressed on through the first weeks and months, generating no name and no evidence sufficient to move forward. All that remained was the biological material sitting in storage, waiting for the day when technology could extract from it what 1964 had no capacity to read, and a family set out on the longest journey of their lives, carrying a question that would go unanswered for 58 years. The Marise Chiverella case was never one that the Pennsylvania State Police closed and quietly set aside. More than 230 members of the force worked on it at various points across those 58 years. Investigators who had picked up the file as young detectives and stayed with it until retirement, others who worked it for a few months, and others who devoted years to it. More than 4,000 pages of documents accumulated over the decades. Interview reports, investigative notes, suspect files, test results, piece after piece of information that never combined into a name. The Pennsylvania State Police had existed for 117 years as of 2022, and more than half of that entire history had included active work on the case of a 9-year-old girl in Hazleton. What set the Marise Chiverella case apart from many other cold cases was not national fame, political pressure, or high-profile advocacy. It was the systematic and unwavering persistence of a police force that kept the file open without any external pressure compelling them to do so. When new technology emerged, improved blood type analysis in the 1970s, protein electrophoresis in the 1980s, DNA profiling in the 1990s and 2000s, the case was revisited through each new lens. Every new suspect was pursued to a conclusion. Nobody was eliminated without clear justification, and nobody was added to the suspect list without a solid basis for doing so. Through the 1970s, 1990s, and 2000s, new names continued to surface and be ruled out, each one adding another investigative thread that was opened and then closed, each one contributing more pages to a file that had already grown to 4,000. In 2007, when DNA technology had advanced to the point where the biological evidence collected from Marie's clothing on March 18, 1964 could be fully analyzed and used to create a complete personal genetic profile, the Pennsylvania State Police DNA Laboratory accomplished something that would have been completely beyond imagination 43 years earlier. They extracted a full DNA profile of Marie's killer from evidence that had been sitting in storage for over 4 decades. That profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. No match was returned. Marie's killer had never been convicted of a felony in the United States, and his DNA had not entered any forensic database through any conventional pathway, not during his lifetime and not after his death. More than 40 years after March 18, 1964, police finally possessed a complete, accurate, and usable DNA profile of the killer. What they did not have was a name to attach to it. The next phase of the investigation would stretch across another 15 years before an answer came from a direction nobody had predicted. Carmen Marie Radicki is Marie's younger sister. The Chiverella family had 5 children. Marie's death left a void that could not be filled, an empty chair at the dinner table, an empty place in the bedroom, younger siblings left asking why their sister had not come home. But the loss came with a particular and brutal clarity. The worst was confirmed on the very afternoon of March 18, 1964. There was no prolonged period of uncertain hope. There was no window during which the family clung to the possibility of a different ending. They knew what had happened to Marie from that day forward. What they did not know, and would not know for 58 years, was who. There was no name, no face, no person who could be questioned or charged or made to stand in a courtroom and answer for what had happened on that road between their home and St. Joseph's School. Carmen grew up carrying her sister's memory alongside a question that had no answer. Who had done this? Who was that person? Where were they now? The Chiverella family maintained periodic contact with the Pennsylvania State Police across the decades, asking about progress, receiving calls from investigators confirming the search was continuing, and following every development when new technology was applied to the case. In 2019, the Pennsylvania State Police utilized technology developed by Parabon Nanolabs, a company that had pioneered a technique for generating predicted images of a person's physical appearance directly from genetic information, to produce 3 facial sketches of the suspect showing what he might have looked like at the ages of 25, 40, and 60, based entirely on the DNA profile recovered from the 1964 evidence. The images were released to the public in March 2019. A white male with dark hair and a broad nose, a face reconstructed from genetic data in a manner that would have been utterly unthinkable when the crime was committed. The sketches were shared on social media with a public appeal for any information about anyone who might match the description. Tips came in from across the community. People studied the sketches and thought of neighbors, former acquaintances, old co-workers, people they had known in Hazleton decades earlier. Every tip was followed up. None led to an answer. Forte had died in 1980, and nobody in his circle of acquaintances connected his name to those sketches, perhaps because he had been dead for so long, perhaps because those who had known him could not recognize him in the generated image, or perhaps because nearly 40 years had eroded whatever memories people might have held of him. But the 2019 Parabon sketches accomplished something that no previous method had managed in quite the same way. They brought the Marise Chiverella case to a wider public audience than it had ever reached before. Pennsylvania media picked up the story. Cold case platforms shared it. Information about the 1964 murder in Hazleton reached people who had never heard Marise's name until that moment. By 2019 and 2020, investigators had arrived at a clear and unavoidable realization. CODIS and every conventional investigative method had failed to crack the case across 55 years, and it was now clear they never would, because the killer's DNA simply was not in the system. The only remaining path forward was genetic genealogy, searching public databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA for biological relatives of the suspect, constructing family trees from those distant partial matches, and narrowing them down branch by branch until only one name remained. It was the same method that had identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 and was solving cold cases across America with increasing regularity. And that was precisely when a college student sitting at home during the pandemic came across articles about the Marise Chiverella case, articles that had circulated after Parabon released the facial sketches, and decided to send an email to the Pennsylvania State Police asking if he could help with skills he had been developing since he was 10 years old. Eric Schubert's passion for genealogy had begun at age 10. Starting with family trees built for relatives, he had gradually progressed to helping people locate their biological parents. By 2020, Schubert was a junior history student at Elizabethtown College in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Home because of the pandemic, he read about the Marise Chiverella case and later described his reaction simply. The crime was horrific and disturbing, it hit him hard, and he knew that if there was any way he could help, he wanted to. He composed an email to the Pennsylvania State Police introducing himself as a college student with genetic genealogy skills who had read about the case, and offering his assistance if it would not interfere with anyone's existing work. Trooper Petrusky, who received that email, later reflected on the unusual decision to bring a college student volunteer onto an active state police cold case file. He acknowledged that it was somewhat outside the norm for the Pennsylvania State Police. He also said the decision had been rewarded. Schubert began working with the DNA profile that had been developed from the biological evidence collected from Marise's clothing on March 18, 1964. He uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases including GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, searching for biological relatives of the suspect, people who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to those platforms in order to find family connections, with no awareness that their genetic information might one day be used to identify a relative of a killer. The first result that came back was extraordinarily distant, potentially a sixth cousin of the attacker, someone who shared just enough DNA with the killer to register as a faint match in the database, but nowhere near close enough to point to him directly. From that remote starting point, Schubert began the painstaking work of constructing the family tree. It required searching birth records, marriage records, death records, census documents, local newspaper archives, all the scattered fragments of information scattered across public records that, when assembled correctly, gradually built a picture that became more specific, more narrow, and closer to a single name with every passing month. Schubert later described it as probably the hardest genealogy challenge he had ever faced, and the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He worked on the case for 2 years, from the day he sent that volunteer email as an 18-year-old college student to the day he stood before the press as a 20-year-old. At some point during those 2 years, as the family tree tightened down to a small cluster of possible suspects, Schubert understood that he was about to find the answer. And from that family tree, one final name emerged, James Paul Forte, a 22-year-old bartender in Hazleton in 1964, living 6 blocks from where Marie had disappeared on the morning of March 18. James Paul Forte was a Hazleton local. Not someone passing through. Not a stranger from out of town. He was a man born and raised in the coal mining communities of eastern Pennsylvania, someone whose presence on the streets of Hazleton drew no attention or suspicion because he belonged there in the way that only a lifelong resident belongs to a city. He worked behind the bar of a local establishment, meeting people, knowing regular customers by name, listening to the stories of strangers, existing comfortably within the fabric of the community. He lived 6 blocks from the spot where Marise Chiverella was last seen before vanishing on that March morning. And he had previously been charged with a violent sexual assault on a surviving victim, a criminal history that made clear March 18, 1964 was not an isolated outburst but part of an established pattern of behavior. After March 18, 1964, James Paul Forte continued living in Hazleton, in the same city where the Chiverella family was living with the weight of that morning. He kept working as a bartender. He kept moving through the community. He kept existing in the city where the little girl he had killed had grown up. 16 years passed. 16 years during which nobody knocked on his door and asked the right questions. 16 years during which the biological evidence sat in police storage waiting for technology that did not yet exist. He died in May 1980 of natural causes, most likely a heart attack, at the age of 38. 16 years after killing Marie. 42 years before his name would first appear anywhere in the investigation, emerging from the family tree that an 18-year-old college student had begun building during a pandemic. When the name James Paul Forte surfaced from the family tree Eric Schubert had spent 2 years constructing, Pennsylvania State Police investigators faced the final challenge of the entire 58-year investigation, definitively confirming that Forte was the man whose DNA matched the biological evidence collected from Marie's clothing on March 18, 1964. And Forte had been dead since May 1980, 42 years before his name had first entered the picture. There was no living person to approach for a voluntary sample. There were no shortcuts. There was only one available path: exhumation. In January 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police exhumed the body of James Paul Forte. Investigators extracted samples from Forte's remains and sent them to the laboratory to be compared against the DNA profile the Pennsylvania State Police DNA Lab had developed in 2007 from biological evidence collected and preserved 43 years earlier. On February 3, 2022, the results came back. The DNA from James Paul Forte's exhumed remains was an exact match to the DNA recovered from Marie and Chiverella's clothing on March 18, 1964. The accuracy of the result far exceeded any legal or scientific threshold for certainty. The Pennsylvania State Police put the figure into perspective this way: it is estimated that approximately 117 billion human beings have ever lived on Earth. To find another person whose DNA matched the evidence as precisely as Forte's did, you would need to search across more than 4 million planets identical to Earth. This was not a matter of probability or reasonable doubt. It was absolute and irrefutable confirmation that James Paul Forte was the man on that road between Marie's home and St. Joseph's School on the morning of March 18, 1964. On February 10, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference in Hazleton. The room was filled not only with media but with current and retired investigators spanning multiple generations, including the very first officer who had worked Marie's case back in 1964, a man who had lived long enough to stand in that room and hear the answer that the investigation he had started could not complete. Also present were Marie's 4 surviving siblings and members of her extended family. And standing there alongside career law enforcement officers was Eric Schubert, 20 years old, a college student positioned as a colleague among people who had devoted their professional lives to this work, because he had accomplished what none of them had been able to. Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator, addressed the press in a voice that was steady but unmistakably full of the emotion of someone who had lived with this case long enough to understand the full weight of that day. He called it a very important day for the agency, and said that even though it had taken nearly 58 years, he believed it should give hope to victims' families across the state and across the country, hope that no matter how long it takes, law enforcement will never give up. He closed with words that carried the meaning of the entire 58-year journey: in life or in death, you will be found. Carmen Marie Radicki, Marie's younger sister who had grown up without her older sibling beside her, stood before the press and spoke about the memories the family still held of Marie, and about the emptiness and sadness that her absence had left behind, feelings that would never fully go away. But she also said that her family now knew the identity of the person who had killed their sister. Justice, she said, had been served. The Marie Chiverella case was not solved by any single factor working alone. It was solved because multiple factors aligned at the right moment and in the right combination. Biological evidence collected and preserved in 1964 by investigators following proper procedure. A full DNA profile developed in 2007 when technology had finally advanced far enough to make it possible. 15 consecutive years of monthly database checks by a force that never closed the file. The 2019 Parabon facial sketch that brought Marise's story back into broad public awareness, widely enough that a college student in Pennsylvania read about her and decided to reach out. And Eric Schubert's decision to send that email and ask whether he could help. A single question that led to the answer that 58 years, 230 investigators, and 4,000 pages of documents had been unable to find. The Marise Ann Chiverella case leaves behind specific lessons that anyone in America can apply. The first is for families of cold case victims, particularly in cases where biological evidence was collected at the scene. Contact the investigating agency and ask 2 direct questions. Is the biological evidence still preserved, and has the DNA profile been uploaded to GEDmatch or FamilyTree DNA for genetic genealogy analysis? CODIS and genetic genealogy are fundamentally different tools. CODIS can only identify a suspect if his DNA is already in the system from a prior conviction. Genetic genealogy can identify a suspect through his biological relatives even if he was never convicted of anything, and even if he has been dead for decades. The Marise Chiverella case demonstrates that a case CODIS could not solve across 15 years of monthly checks was resolved in 2 years through genetic genealogy, but only because the investigating agency was willing to pursue that method. The second lesson is for anyone interested in contributing to cold case work without being a police officer or forensic professional. Consider voluntarily registering your DNA at dnasolves.com, a database created specifically to support criminal investigations rather than for commercial purposes. And if you have genealogy skills similar to Eric Schubert's, understand that law enforcement agencies are increasingly open to working with volunteer experts. Schubert's email changed the outcome of a 58-year-old case. Nobody knows whose next email, sent with the right skills at the right time, will change which case next. If Marise Chiverella's story moved you, please subscribe so you do not miss the cases still to come. Every name behind every cold case file deserves to be told, and your presence here is the reason we continue. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. We will see you in the next one.